Okay, so our last speaker is an individual that is constantly writing and speaking about the Civil War. He maintains 2 websites. Hopefully you can get a view of those. So let's welcome Richard Titterington. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you for the invitation. Just want to let you know I'm a substitute. Originally scheduled to speak on this topic was Arnold Schofield, former superintendent at Fort Scott National Historic Site, former superintendent at Mine Creek State Historic Site, and currently the historian for the Civil War Roundtable of Kansas City. I'd like to thank Arnold for recommending that I substitute for him. So thanks, Arnold. Okay, Prairie Sunset. We're going to talk about the conclusion of the raid, or the expedition, or depending upon your persuasion. And I do realize that I'm the only thing between you and happy hour, so I'll try to keep this moving. Okay, what the topics I want to cover is briefly after Westport, where the Federals and commanders get together and decide to continue the pursuit. And then, of course, I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on the events of October 25th, 4 battles that sealed the fate of the Confederate Army. And I'll talk about what some people call the Second Battle of Newtonia, where Blunt decided to attack the Confederates and then realized he had made a mistake. And then we'll talk a little bit about Price's retreat to the Indian Territory. And included with that, the Federals' return after they gave up the pursuit of Price. A fun time was not had by all. And then we'll talk about some conclusions, like everybody else did. So after Westport, this is Curtis's writing in his official report. Basically, the commanders, Pleasanton and Curtis and Blunt, met at Elijah Thomas's farmhouse near Indian Creek in Jackson County. And Pleasanton thought his job was done. Price was on the move south. Pleasanton thought, I don't want to do this anymore. And so, but Rosecrans, who wasn't there at the meeting, but he was an independent, he was in favor of continuing the pursuit. Curtis absolutely was in favor of continuing the pursuit. And so Curtis, Pleasanton deferred to his commanding officer, and they continued the pursuit. Pleasanton's cavalry division and Curtis's volunteer regular cavalry regiments, but also the Kansas State Militia. Although they did decide to release the Kansas State Militia from the northern part of the state so they could go home and vote, because in a couple weeks there's going to be an election. Okay, I forgot to do that. I've got 2 things here. So, after Westport, the Confederates continued moving south. And this is, we met Lieutenant Colonel McLean earlier, Price's adjutant. He kept a running diary of their itinerary. It just seems a little odd to call it an itinerary, but it is. Encamped on the middle fork of the Grand River after traveling 24 miles. So after Westport, they continued going south for 24 miles. They're following down the state line road. And then later, when they reach West Point in Bates County, they move into Kansas to get on the road to Fort Scott. Because Price is heading for Fort Scott next, and all of its quartermaster supplies. M. Jeff Thompson, the retreat was a bit chaotic, even at this point. M. Jeff Thompson, commander of the Iron Brigade in Shelby's division, we arrived after nightfall to find the trains camped in the greatest confusion. I at last found a portion of our wagons, and we here passed a rather gloomy night, feeling the fatigue occasioned by the constant fighting of the past 3 days. So the Confederates were all jumbled up in this bivouac south of Westport. John Phillips, in command of the 7th Missouri, well, he's in command of the 1st Brigade in Pleasanton's division. He writes in his diary, camped near Little Santa Fe on the Kansas line, had bed made down by fire, sweet sleep, Pleasanton thinks better of myself and the MSN since the fight. We don't know if that's really true or not, but Phillips thought that they had done a good job in the fighting on the 22nd and 23rd. Okay, the next day, when the Confederates leave their bivouac, the wagon train already is becoming a problem, and the Teamsters are beginning to realize, hey, we're being chased, and these wagons aren't moving very quickly. And so they start discarding things they consider to be non-essential. And we get an idea of those from Private Edwin Carpenter, who was in Company K of the 17th Illinois Cavalry, part of the pursuing force. He described what they saw as they moved, going after the Confederates. We came upon bales of rope, harnesses, grindstones, boxes, and barrels of merchandise, and everything from a clock to a spinning wheel. For many miles, these articles were strewn over the prairie. So the Teamsters are trying to lighten their loads by throwing everything they think is non-essential already with the wagon train as it's moving south after Westport. The Federals are also suffering. It's not all bed and roses for the Federals. For 7 days, this is again Private Carpenter, for 7 days most of us have had nothing but corn picked from the fields. Once we came upon a lot of the carcasses of cattle. The rebels had killed them and cut off most of the meat. We picked the bones, not having time or wood for a fire, we eat the raw meat. Yeah. So they're hungry just like the Confederates are. So that brings us to October 25th, the day of reckoning, as I call it. So, we have 4 battles that take place on October 25th. And think of them, they're all rear guard actions, as the Confederates are trying to get away from the Federals and get that wagon train back to Arkansas. So it starts up here in the so-called Battle of the Mounds. It actually starts shortly after midnight. There's some skirmishing that starts, but most of the fighting, and we'll get into more detail, begins around 6 o'clock in the morning at dawn. Then late morning is the Battle of so you were probably familiar with Mine Creek, so we'll talk about that as well. Then another fight that happens on the Little Osage River. And then the 4th battle, Charlotte's Farm, or the Battle of Arlington, that happens late in the early evening, late afternoon. So 4 fights that happen on October 25th over a distance of 32 miles between the first and the last. So, the mountains. And you can see the mountains if you drive down 69 Highway, right before you get to Trading Post. They're right there. 69 Highway goes right in between them. This is where this fight took place. So what we have is, in the pursuit, James Blunt, who is in the Army of the Border, he's in the lead. And he gets down to this area, down here, and he realizes there's a Confederate rear guard skirmish line set up on the mounds. And so he waits, Curtis and Pleasanton show up, and Blunt has some intelligence that there's a ford, a crossing on the Mardisine River, just a few miles upstream from here. And so Blunt is arguing, I'll take my forces, go upstream, cross over, and come and hit the Confederates on the flank. Curtis and Pleasanton are having none of it. They think that's too complicated. And they say, well, we're going to wait for the rest of Pleasanton's division to catch up. And so Sanborn arrives, and they decide to put Sanborn in operational command of this attack. So, and it's I hate to use the word jumble, but it's a jumble of different units from different brigades. So there's the 2nd Colorado, there's the 4th Iowa Cav, and then there's regiments from Sanborn's brigade, the 6th and 8th MSN, Missouri State Militia Cav. So as I mentioned, Sanborn initiates the attack shortly after midnight, and it's raining and it's dark, of course. And Sanborn's not familiar with the ground. There's some skirmishing that goes on, and Sanborn decides to fall back and say, we'll wait for it to get light. And then they attack. And standing in their way are 2 brigades from Fagan's division, Slemons and Cabell's brigade. So this is Major A.B.L. Pierce of the 4th Iowa Cavalry. He's in command of the regiment. I was ordered by General Sanborn to take the hill on the right before daylight. It was very dark and raining, the hill steep and rocky, but the men moved forward, having to climb the steep rocks upon their hands and knees. The enemy kept up a brisk fire all the time over our heads. As soon as they found we were coming upon them, they left their strong position. So again, this is just a rear guard action, not a big fight by any stretch of the imagination. The wagon train has gotten across the river that's just south of this location, the Mardisine River, and so the Confederates fall back to catch up to the wagon train. Which brings us to Mine Creek. So the Federals don't stop, they continue pursuing. And now it's Pleasanton's, the other other brigades from Pleasanton's cavalry division. The 1st Brigade under Colonel John Phillips, and the 4th Brigade, Winslow's brigade, but as we've learned, Winslow's no longer in command because he was wounded and out of action. So command devolved to Lieutenant Colonel Frederick W. Benteen, who was the commander of the 10th Missouri Cavalry. So they're in the lead, and they're coming up, and the Confederates know that the pursuit is coming on hot and heavy. And this is John B. Clark Jr., who we've heard about several times today, up to this point. He says, we retired at a trot, the enemy in close pursuit. We came suddenly upon the trains, halted. They're not across Mine Creek yet. The enemy not more than 500 yards in our rear. There was no time to make any but the most rapid dispositions for battle. And this is key to this fight, is the Confederates didn't have time to get prepared to make their stand. Okay, so Mine Creek. What we have is Marmaduke and Fagan deploy themselves into the line of battle. And because they don't have time, the decision is made for them to stay mounted. They do not. During the Battle of Westport, 99% of that battle was fought dismounted over those 3 days. But this one, the Confederates stay mounted. This is a real cavalry action where there's a cavalry charge by the Federals attacking the Confederate position. So you have Phillips over on the right, Federal right, left of the screen. Push the right button here. And Benteen. Benteen deploys his brigade, in each regiment in a column. So his 10th Missouri Cav is in front, the 4th Iowa Cavalry is behind him, and then I don't remember which, the 3rd Iowa and the other one. But because it's the 4th Iowa Cav, I'm a big fan of the 4th Iowa Cavalry. So they're the heroes of the day, or not the day, the fight. So you have Benteen coming on the left, and Benteen orders a charge. So this is Marmaduke. The advance of the enemy had been so persistent. The advance of the enemy had been so persistent and strong during the morning, and the progress of our train so slow, that I was compelled to go into position and deliver battle without waiting for the return of the division of General Shelby. So as soon as Price knew, because Price had sent Shelby on to capture Fort Scott, and as soon as Price knew he had a problem of the Federals catching up to him, he sent just a messenger to get Shelby to turn back. So Shelby's on his way back, but he's not there at this point in time. This is Benteen's version of what happened. Now, his report is much longer than this, but I didn't want to put you to sleep reading, all that. So, he writes, "The fire of the enemy was now so hot that for a moment it staggered even my own gallant regiment." They're always gallant when they're writing about their own people. "But it soon recovered and went on with an exulting yell. There ensued a fierce hand-to-hand fight, one that surpassed anything for the time it lasted I have ever witnessed." So a little hyperbole, that's okay. But this is the story that I think is probably a little more accurate. Abiel Pierce, the commander of the 4th Iowa Cavalry. Because when you read his official reports, in one of them he sounds so indignant that his regiment wasn't given credit for this fight. And so our lines moved to within 300 yards of the enemy when a terrific fire was poured into us. So the Confederates that deployed in line of battle on their horses, and they had those Enfield rifle muskets, and they let loose a volley, and it staggered Benteen's brigade. The 4th did not halt, because they were second in line. They didn't get the brunt of the volley. The 10th Missouri Cav got the brunt. The 4th did not halt, but swept on, every horse at full speed, every man yelling like a demon. We struck the enemy's lines on the extreme right, scattering them as we came up. My regiment was the first to break the enemy lines. Now, Pierce also mentions that with his own saber, he took out 7 or 8 of the enemy during this hand-to-hand fight. But again, remember, the 4th Iowa Cavalry and much of Winslow's brigade was armed with Spencer carbines, 7-shot repeating carbines. Carbines are shorter than Enfields. You don't have to, they're easy to reload, but you can shoot off 7 shots before reloading. Whereas the Confederates let loose that volley, and probably while they were trying to reload their single-shot muzzle-loading Enfields, Pierce hit them. The 4th Iowa Cav hit them. And so we have Brigadier General John B. Clark Jr. confirming what Pierce said. The Federal force made a furious charge on our right and left flank. Both gave way in hopeless confusion. Every effort was made by appeals and threats to retrieve the rout, but it swept in an irresistible mass ungovernable. So the Confederates were totally put into disarray by this attack from the Federals at Mine Creek. And as was the quiz earlier, we know that Marmaduke was captured. Private Dunleavy, I think was his name, and he received the Congressional Medal of Honor for this. Which brings us to Little Osage River. So Marmaduke and Fagan's division are just streaming down the military road, going ahead and trying to get as fast away from the Federals as possible after Mine Creek. And Shelby finally arrives on the scene at the Little Osage River, where he sets up on the north side of the river a rear guard line of defense to try and hold off the Federal pursuit so Fagan and Marmaduke's division could get away. And again, the wagon train is still lumbering its way down the river. So here we have the Little Osage River. Again, it's near present-day Fulton, Kansas, and it happened just east of 69 Highway. Again, it's primarily Thompson's brigade here from Shelby's division. And Shelby, well, I say Shelby writes in his official report. Major John Edwards actually wrote all the reports for Shelby. I don't even know if Shelby ever read them before they got turned in, but he probably trusted Edwards That's why Shelby's reports, if you think Benteen's report had a little hyperbole in it, Shelby's reports are just chock full of hyperbole. So, the first stand was made 1 mile north of the Little Osage River, where the enemy was worsted, again upon the riverbank, and again I got away in good condition. Then taking position on a high hill 1 mile south of the river, I halted for a desperate struggle. The fight lasted nearly an hour, but I was at last forced to fall back. So again, the rearguard action was successful. We held off the Federals. And the third fight is completed. But now there's yet another fight that's going to happen. And that's going to happen, or this is, I'll skip ahead here. And that's going to be at Charlotte's Farm, just north of the Marmaton River. So Price has given up the hope of capturing Fort Scott. He's diverted back into Missouri. And now he's trying to cross the Marmaton, get the wagon train across the Marmaton River. And it's going about as well as it's gone before. The wagon train is struggling to get across the Marmaton River. This is then Jeff Thompson, who had just completed fighting at the Little Osage River. And so he comes down and continues down the road, pell-mell, trying to catch up to the wagon train, and the wagon train is still struggling to get across the river. He said, in a few miles we struck the rear of the column, halted, and understood that the train was still crossing the Marmaton Creek. And then came that patience-wearing practice of keeping thousands mounted and moving up 20 feet every 5 minutes as some wagon would cross the creek. Now this is something Thompson wrote long after the war was over. And he was never one to mince words when he was complaining about other people's actions. So maybe this is a little exaggerated, but it's probably still reasonably accurate. So Charlotte's Farm. Here we have Pleasanton. Now it's Benteen and McNeil's brigade that are going to be involved in the attack at Charlotte's Farm. Shelby's in operational command. He is Price's best, combat leader. He's got Thompson. He's also got Dobbin's brigade from Fagan's division set up in line of battle. Collins' battery is deployed. Tyler is the brigaded unarmed recruits. So they're just there for show. And Jackman is in reserve. So Jackman's brigade is in reserve. McNeil, everybody on both sides, humans and animals, horses, are exhausted. Dan started talking about fighting that happened in Lexington on October 19th. It's almost been continuous to this point, fighting over and moving over long distances. So everyone's exhausted. And McNeil writes about this. I endeavored to charge, supported in the effort by Colonel Benteen, but the utmost exertions of officers and men could not move the horses to a trot or a gallop. I steadily advanced in line at walk toward the enemy, who continued to retire. So the Federals are moving on the Confederates, and but it's a slow movement, but it's being fairly successful. And Shelby orders Jackman into the fight. And this is, Colonel Jackman came rushing up to avenge his fallen comrades. Going into line at a gallop, he charged down upon the rushing enemy like a thunderbolt, driving them back and scattering their front line badly. This charge saved us, and the day's work was done. The Federals halted, reformed their lines, brought out artillery, and fired away at long range. Very slowly, the army moved away without molestation, and darkness came. So we had another successful rearguard action, holding the Federals off so the wagon train can continue south. But Price has finally come to the conclusion that the wagon train is a problem for his army. Because on October 25th, his army was almost destroyed. So, let's talk a little bit about the aftermath of October 25th. Okay, we've heard some of this, so I won't get into the story. I've got to tell the story because I've got it, right? But we've already heard a little bit about this. Those overcoats that were mentioned in Glasgow that they captured. And we've also heard it was cold. It was a cold fall. Unlike today, what is it, like 85 out there now? It wasn't like that back then. So, if you're cold and there are coats nearby, you put them on. So the 1,200 Confederates that got overcoats were probably pretty doggone happy to have those coats on. But there's a little bit of an issue because after Mine Creek, about 1,000 prisoners were captured, and a lot of them were wearing those blue overcoats. There was a standing order during the war, because Confederate guerrillas in Missouri would wear Union uniforms as disguises to be able to surprise the Federals when they went against them. So there was a standing order. You capture a Confederate soldier in a Union uniform, you will kill them. They will be executed. And this is John Phillips writing his report. In my reading of it, very matter-of-factly, a number of prisoners taken in this fight were dressed in our uniform, and in obedience to existing orders from department headquarters and the usages of war, they were executed instanter, while those taken in Confederate uniform were recognized and treated as prisoners of war. So it depended upon what coat you were wearing.
That's not just at that time, that has been and still is the rule.
Mm-hmm.
You can wear it, the enemy's uniform, but you have to put something on the outside of it to show that it isn't their uniform anymore.
Okay, which brings us to Price finally decides the wagon train is an albatross around his neck. I'm not going to read this order, but this is his General Orders number 22 that he issued on October 25th, basically describing what are essential wagons. He details, we will only keep these wagons, and we will destroy all the other wagons and everything they contain. He ended up destroying around 200 wagons from his wagon train. John McNeil sees those wagons. Around 10 a.m. on October 26th, I renewed the pursuit of Price and found his trail well defined with the debris of burning wagons, artillery ammunition scattered along the road for miles, camp equipage, mess kits, plunder, and arms thrown away, all evinced the demoralization consequent upon the vigorous attacks of the preceding day. At his camp, over 200 wagons were destroyed by him. The retreat, of course, continues. So at this point, something I find kind of surreal happens. Pleasanton is ill. He's getting sick. He doesn't feel well. And he decides after Marmaton, Charlotte's Farm, to go into Fort Scott for R&R, basically, rest and refit. Again, they haven't eaten, the horses need food. And so he goes in with 3 of his brigades, Phillips, Benteen, and Sanborn. Now he leaves McNeil on the field. And I don't know if this is stemming back to what happened on October 23rd, a little passive-aggressive, getting even with McNeil. But in pursuance of orders from the commanding general, I bivouacked my command on the battlefield, passing another night without either forage or rations. So McNeil has to spend the night in the field near Charlotte's Farm, while everybody else gets to go into Fort Scott and get some food and feed their horses. Blunt, not having any orders to the contrary, sees Pleasanton going into Fort Scott, so he follows him in. And so as the Confederates are continuing south, now unmolested, So Blunt and his brigades go into Fort Scott. And Curtis is beside himself, because what's going on? We're supposed to be chasing after Price, and we're going into Fort Scott. So it takes him a while to get them going again. It takes him until the next day for them to continue the pursuit. So which brings us to Newtonia. So during the Battle of Westport, the Confederates captured about 100 prisoners. Most of them were captured on October 22nd at Mockbee Farm, the 2nd Kansas State Militia that was overrun. And they've had a hard time of it since then, on October 22nd. Guilford Gage, who was in the Topeka Battery, was captured, and he described, we were barefooted, hungry, thirsty beyond the power to describe, worn out, desperate, our feet like pounded meat, our jaws hollow, our bodies worn to mere skeletons covered by yellow parchment. So again, they're not getting food. They would have been relieved of their boots and coats, and so a lot of them are suffering from exposure and other ill things as they're being marched down. Now Gage is actually able to escape before Newtonia in the confusion of the retreat, but all the rest of the prisoners are paroled in Newtonia. However, the Federals from Kansas take note of what they see in these prisoners when they come across the released prisoners. This is Captain Richard Hinton writing about one anecdote that happened during the retreat. It was acts such as these, as well as charges of murdering our comrades after being wounded, that induced the hanging of the couple of the wounded rebels found in a house a few miles from Carthage, where the advance brigade, Colonel Jennison's, had halted for camp. So there was retribution against Confederate prisoners because of what they perceived as mistreatment of Federal prisoners. Another anecdote at Newtonia. There was a small garrison at Newtonia, commanded by Lieutenant Robert Christian. According to a newspaper article, for more than 2 years, the lieutenant and his commander distinguished themselves by capturing rebels and killing bushwhackers. Now Christian found out that Price was, big Confederate armies heading their way, and so he evacuates his garrison, but he has a problem. His wife is ill and can't be moved. And so he's hanging around town trying to keep an eye on the Confederates capturing. So what happens is one of the Confederates recognize him, one of the Confederates from the area recognize him and claims that he killed his father earlier in the war. And so he goes up and shoots him. Colonel Christian was killed by this man and buried in the Newtonia Cemetery. Blunt now is in the lead, is in the advance. He left Fort Scott and I came up with the enemy at Newtonia at 2 p.m. of the 28th. They deployed a force of about 2,000 men upon the Prairie to protect their rear. Being convinced of their intention to avoid a fight if possible, I determined to attack them at once. So that's his first mistake. Blunt passes through Newtonia. Shelby's division is deployed behind some fences on the McLean farm, and he's got Collins' battery deployed, and Blunt is outnumbered. Because for reasons, although Newtonia is quite a ways away from Fort Scott, but Blunt had told Moonlight, you stay here and get your horses fed. And so Moonlight is no longer with Blunt. It's just two small, almost regimental-sized brigades that Blunt is going to attack the Confederates with. So he's outnumbered, but he attacks. And this is Thompson describing. Our line bravely crossed the fence and advanced upon the enemy, crossing the field under a hot fire of artillery and small arms, and drove the enemy into the open prairie. Not stopping at the second fence an instant, we advanced into the prairie and continued to drive the enemy, never letting him form to engage. So Blunt immediately realizes he's in trouble, outnumbered, going to be flanked, and he's falling back. So he starts falling back from his attack, and Shelby's division is moving against him. So, some of the other brigades had left Fort Scott, and one of them was Brigadier General John Sanborn's brigade in Pleasanton's division had left, but he had taken a more direct route to Newtonia. And so fortunately for Blunt, he arrived on the scene just about when Blunt was in deep trouble. And Blunt describes that in his report. Their superiority of numbers enabling them to press upon the flanks with a large force compelled me to fall back about 500 yards from my first line. It was now near sundown and my command had been engaged near 2 hours and their ammunition nearly exhausted. I was about to direct my line to fall back and take position over the bluff when very unexpectedly the brigade of General Sanborn showed up. So he's bailed out by Sanborn. And Sanborn describes that in his report. So now Shelby withdraws and the second battle of Newtonia is done. Another beautiful victory according to John Edwards. They withdrew. Again, if you think of it as a rearguard action, okay, they held off the Federals. Wagon train is continuing to move south. But I don't know. The retreat continues. We've seen this map before. They turned into Indian territory. Newtonia is really the last fight. There was a little bit of skirmishing that went on. Fayetteville, some of Fagan's division was detached and sent to reinforce a Confederate unit that was trying to attack Fayetteville. Nothing much ever came of that. They crossed the Arkansas on November 7th. That's when the Federals gave up the pursuit. They arrived in Arkansas, Price arrives in Arkansas, because once they got into the Indian Territory, a lot of the Confederate soldiers, troops, that started saying, I think the war's over for me, I'm going home. And so desertion became a problem. Price chose to address that desertion by granting furloughs to whole regiments, saying, you guys go back to Arkansas and we'll reconvene. Okay, I did something bad. I pushed the wrong button, sorry. We'll reconvene at a later date. So, and that was a good thing for Price's army. One, desertion stopped being that big of a problem. Also, it was hard finding food and forage for the animals. And so they were able to eventually make their way back to Arkansas. Oops. So they did suffer as they were getting into Indian territory, even more so than they had been. We have not received anything to eat for 10 days, but poor beef without salt and a little parched corn. The retreat southward from Newtonia was a famine. The flour first gave out, then the meat, then the medicines. Our trail is literally strewn with broken down horses, mules, wagons, and men. Curtis calls off the pursuit. I find it interesting that Curtis always says there were way more Confederates he was going up against than there really were. 30 to 40,000, not even close. This is Edwards writing after the war, but after crossing the Arkansas, the worst stage of misery came upon the Army. Horses died by the thousands. The few wagons were abandoned almost without exception. The sick had no medicines and the healthy no food. Bitter freezing weather added terrors to the route and weakness to the emaciated, staggering column. Smallpox came at last, and hundreds fell out by the wayside to perish without help. So, Federals didn't have it all that much better. After November 7th, in the Indian Territory on the Arkansas River near present-day Sallisaw, Oklahoma, they turned around and go back. They went back by different routes. Winslow's brigade went back the same way they had come, as did Jennison's brigade. So the other brigades went back by different routes. But on the retreat, or on the return, not a retreat, but on the return back to their home station, which is Memphis, the 4th Iowa, this is Sergeant Scott from the 4th Iowa writing, from Tahlequah to Rolla, 400 miles in bitter weather, without shelter, without sufficient food. That shabby and weary column painfully dragged itself along. 20 days and nights it took, though every man burned with desire to reach the end. They actually ended up, for the most of that trip, not riding their horses, but leading their horses, because the horses were also so worn out. So, I need to wrap up. What resulted from this chaos? So I'll talk a little bit about this. We've had a lot of people talking about the results of the expedition. So in Kirby Smith's order to Price, rally the loyal men of Missouri and remember our great want is men, recruits. So how did Price do on recruits? Well, Price said he did great, although earlier he had predicted tens of thousands of recruits just waiting for him to show up in Missouri. But in his report he writes, I brought with me at least 5,000 new recruits. They are still arriving in large numbers daily within our lines. And that's an accurate statement as far as, well, maybe not large numbers, but recruits that had not been able to join him in Boonville were continuing to try and make their way south to join up with him. Major General John Magruder had a little different outlook on these recruits. Price has with him 4,000 or 5,000 recruits unarmed. Transportation must be supplied his army, and many thousand arms, say 10,000, are required to make this unarmed force of any use. And as we know, the Confederates, at the end of the war, the Confederate had an army in the Trans-Mississippi under Kirby Smith of 50,000 men. They had no way to get them across the Mississippi River to the eastern war theaters. Military supplies, all those wagons. Price, again, he was under orders to bring back quartermaster supplies in great quantities if he couldn't stay in Missouri. Price's report, he says, I captured 18 pieces of artillery, 3,000 stand of small arms, yada, yada, yada. He captured all this stuff, and it's probably reasonably accurate that he did capture all this stuff. Hardly any of it made its way back to Arkansas. Once again, we have Magruder. Major General Price has returned, as I am informed, with only about 50 wagons and with fewer arms by 5,000 or 6,000 than he left with, than he took with him on his expedition. So Magruder was not a big fan of the results of the raid. We've already talked about this some. Another objective, well, if we invade Missouri, the Federals are going to have to respond by diverting resources from the east. I won't belabor this point, but they did. This is Major General Sherman, H.A. Smith. Sherman reluctantly agreed, because after Red River, Sherman wanted Smith to rejoin his Army of the Tennessee. And he reluctantly agreed to let Smith, with his 2 divisions of infantry, go into Missouri to go against Price. So I just found this. Can you make a quick job of it and then get to me? Well, as we heard earlier, Smith did reach Nashville on November 30th. It was after Franklin, after the Battle of Franklin, but he was able to participate in the Battle of Nashville. The cavalry brigade that was diverted from the Army of the Tennessee was Winslow's brigade. And we've already heard that he took this long trek through Arkansas, not even catching up to Pleasanton until independence on October 22nd. But they were a very important part of that. Smith, other than the 14th Missouri, was it 14th Missouri at Pilot now? I think. Other than the 14th Missouri, one company from the 14th, no, 14th Iowa, I'm sorry, 14th Iowa at Pilot Knob, who's probably the most experienced fighting force that was at Pilot Knob, was from Smith's 2 Division, right wing of the 16th Army Corps. So, but other than that, Smith never, other than the threat of Smith, he never actually actively fought anything with the infantry. Okay, on the way back, Jennison's brigade, both Winslow's brigade and Jennison's brigade, as they were proceeding through Arkansas again, they were being attacked by small guerrilla bands, and Jennison's men took revenge on the local citizens as they were moving through Arkansas. And this is from a newspaper article talking about Jennison's brigade burning farmhouses and being called Jennison's tombstones. So Jennison was court-martialed after he returned, although he always maintained it was motivated by for political reasons, not by what he did in Arkansas. Another, quickly, depending upon who you read, who you listen to, all those recruits that Price took back, some were willing, some weren't willing, some were conscripted, some were taken against their will. But this is an affidavit by a William Dameron who maintained, he surrendered to authorities in Springfield, and they took him back and they threw him in jail. And this is his affidavit saying, I was taken against my will. I didn't want to go, and they forced me to do it. I got away as soon as I could. And then this is Brigadier General Clinton D. Fisk, who was the primary commander dealing with the Paw Paw Rebellion that happened in July of 1864 in Platte and Clay County. He had to deal with that. Enrolled Missouri militia joining the Confederates and fighting against him. So he had little sympathy for these recruits, Confederate recruits that were saying they had been forced into service through conscription. So, not sure what happened to William Dameron. He was in prison in St. Louis for a while. And we've already talked about this. Thomas Fletcher, the result of Price's raid in Missouri, radical Republicans were swept into office. There was delegates elected to a new Missouri State Convention. They were all radical Republican leaning, and they're the ones that passed the Emancipation Ordinance that Fletcher issued on January 11th, 1865. The delegates were also given the authority to draft a brand new constitution, or actually just amend the current constitution so slavery would be abolished, and they did that. And that disloyalists disenfranchised rather. Charles Drake, and it became known as the Drake Constitution, Charles Drake convinced the delegates, well, instead of amending, let's just write a whole new constitution. Oh, and by the way, I happen to have it right here. And it had this long list of oaths that if you couldn't say yes to every single one of them, you were a disloyal Missourian during the war. And I know I'm out of time, but there's this one anecdote I have to tell you about the so-called Knuckleburg Oath. Frank Blair campaigned against ratification of this Constitution, and you can see it narrowly passed. It was ratified by a very small margin. Frank Blair Jr. Frank Blair Jr. was one of the key people in 1861 that kept Missouri in the Union. If it hadn't been for him, Missouri would have been a Confederate state from the get-go. He's son of Preston Blair, Republican power broker. Frank Blair Jr. helped found the Republican Party in the state of Missouri, was Lincoln's right-hand man in Missouri. Frank Blair Jr. Campaigned against this Constitution because of the oath, because he said, I could not say that I had not done all of these things. Because he was in communication with Shelby. Shelby was asking him during the war, could you look after my family in Lafayette County? And Frank Blair said, yes, I will. Frank Blair ended up being a major general in the Army of the Tennessee. He was, went on, you know, during the Savannah, Georgia thing to the coast. So Frank Blair ended up switching parties. He was the Democratic vice presidential nominee running against U.S. Grant in 1868 because of this Constitution. This Constitution turned, if you couldn't prove yourself to be loyal, then you were disloyal during the war, and you were disenfranchised, and you couldn't hold a lot of official offices as well. And the Constitution stayed in effect for 10 years. I'm over time, sorry. So I'm done.